My name is Stepan Rapawy, and I had been employed by the U.S. Census Bureau working primarily on Soviet labor force. And after I retired, I decided to write a book on the deportation of Ukrainians from Poland, since I lived through that whole action. I also have a degree from for Georgetown University in Russian area studies. My book deals with the deportation of Ukrainians from Poland in 1945-46. However, the Ukrainian-Polish conflict started centuries earlier, so I traced the Polish-Ukrainian conflict through the centuries to put this in a historic context, so that this was not something that just erupted accidentally. This had continued in various forms for centuries, because some authors maintain that the deportation and the Polish-Ukrainian conflict was caused by rise of modern nationalism and the integral nationalism. Now, these modern ideologies, of course, stoked the existing conflict. However, the conflict begins in 981. So it is important for me to put this in some kind of a long-term perspective. And so I decided to write this. Now, after World War II, millions of people were deported from their homes, mostly Germans from Eastern Europe. And the Ukrainian-Polish conflict and the deportations in terms of that context is kind of minimal. However, this conflict, the deportation of Ukrainians from Poland, is in many ways unique. Number one, it lasted for 3 years, which was much more than any other deportation process. And secondly, it was met with determined armed resistance. And this was something that did not occur elsewhere. And so from that point alone, I thought it would be worthwhile to explore this, especially since this particular event, as I mentioned, gets lost in the more larger events of World War II. And so after I retired, it was also a good time to start to work on this book, because the archives in Poland and in Ukraine became available dealing with this topic. And fortunately, I have Vistula in Poland, and Volodymyr Serhiychuk in Ukraine went through these archives and published this material, because I had the visions of heading to the archives in Eastern Europe, and I went to the Library of Congress over here in Washington, D.C., and to my great delight, I came across these books. Vistula published approximately 500 archival documents dealing with this matter, and Serhiychuk did comparable work from the Ukrainian archives from the Soviet side. And so at this point, I felt I had ample archival documentation to present a fairly complete picture of what had happened. And so I started working on the book. It is addressed, but it is not sufficiently addressed, in my view. The point is that during the war, the Polish-Ukrainian civilian conflict continued in various stages, and then it really burst into full-blown conflict in the spring of 1943, and the conflict was both in Western Ukraine and in the Polish districts, in the Ukrainian district, I should say, that later became Poland. And so much more emphasis is always placed the Polish-Ukrainian conflict in Western Ukraine, while the conflict on the Polish side is sort of an afterthought, and it's generally portrayed very poorly. That is, it's not exhaustively discussed, and so I try to fill that vacuum. This of course is discussed. It depends on the aim of the historian and the depth to which he wants to go into. It is discussed that people were forcibly removed, but there really is very little elaboration. The other point is that because OON initially worked with Germany, especially from the Soviet point of view, this is portrayed as some kind of a Nazi attack, and for instance, in Polish literature that I looked at, the archival literature, many atrocities committed by the Germans are attributed to the UPA. And so, everybody has their point of view. And so I try to be as objective as it was possible. The deportations of Ukrainians in Poland was put into motion in the summer of 1944 when the Red Army crossed the Buch River, and in July of 44, and established the National Liberation Committee. These were sometimes referred to as the Moscow Poles. They were part of the Communist International, representing the Polish Communist Party in Moscow, and these folks, primarily these people, were dubbed the Polish National Liberation Committee. Sometimes it's called the Lublin Committee, where they were organized in the Polish eastern town of Lublin. And immediately the Soviet Union proceeded to recognize them as a provisional government of Poland, despite the fact that there was Polish government in exile in London. And of course, the Soviet government had nothing to do with the Polish government in London. They were claiming that these are the people who fought the Germans there in Poland, and they are the true representative. So immediately, certain things were set in motion. First of all, in July of 1947, there was a border agreement signed between Poland and the Soviet Union. Basically, the territories, about one-third of Poland, of the pre-war Poland, included Western Ukraine, Belarus, and some areas in Lithuania. These, according to this agreement, these territories were detached from Poland and added to the corresponding Soviet republics in that area. The new border stretched from the Carpathian Mountains all the way to the Baltic Sea, and so according to this new border, maybe 750,000 Ukrainians or whatever were left in the Ukrainian districts on the Polish side, basically west of Buch and Sian rivers. Then this was immediately followed by the population exchange agreement. The population exchange agreement was signed on September 9, 1944 in Lublin, Poland. Khrushchev signed for Ukraine, he was then the Communist Party secretary in Ukraine, and Edward Ossopka-Moravsky, who was part of this Lublin committee, he signed for Poland. Now, the agreement initially specifies clearly that this was to be voluntary resettlement. No force, direct or indirect, shall be used. And the Ukrainians in Poland, also those who call themselves Rusians or Lemkos, had the right to relocate to Ukraine, and the Poles in Western Ukraine, that was part of Poland between the wars, had the right to emigrate to Poland. And the agreement, the exchange of populations was to commence on October 15, 1944, and was to end on February 1, 1945. And the deadline could be extended if necessary. And so immediately after the formalities of this agreement, on September 20th, Soviet Population Exchange Committee, 25 members arrived in Poland. They were headed by Mykola Podhorny. And Podhorny was a Ukrainian who, during the Brezhnev era in the 1970s, was the chairman of this Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. This was the highest governmental position in the Soviet Union, and it could be equated to some extent as the head of state. So he arrived, and subsequently the commission was expanded into about 300 people, as I recall, and they were basically stationed in county seats and major towns where there were railroad stations, because the people eventually were to be moved by railroads to Ukraine. Now, when the Soviet Union started organizing pro-Soviet government, it met with all sorts of resistance. First of all, there was the continuation of Polish attacks on the Ukrainian population in the home area, which began in the spring of 1943, and it intensified as the time went on. Eventually, the Ukrainians formed their self-defense units, and they were reinforced by the UPA from the east, and eventually sort of a front line was established along the Huchva River, stretching for about 100 miles. By the time the Red Army arrives in 44, these attacks have subsided but still continue. And during this time, there's also resistance by Poles to the new forming of the new communist government in Poland, and so the immediately campaign starts encouraging people to register and vote. At this point, by mid-1945, about 125,000 Ukrainians left out of about 700,000. Most who left were from the home area, where they had sustained about 15,000 civilian casualties during a year and a half of Polish attacks. And they were naturally concerned that once the Red Army moves on, these attacks would. There were also some villages in western Lemko region where there was still a Russophile movement. Some villages over there left I guess they left more or less voluntarily. And there were some people here and there that left for whatever reason. Some had everything destroyed in the war, and they just decided to take a chance on moving to Ukraine. As the so-called voluntary agreement exchange is proceeding, and as I mentioned earlier, most of the people leave from the home area because they're frightened of another Polish attacks, and some from Lemko region. It becomes apparent to the authorities that this so-called voluntary exchange is not working. And so, in September 1945, the Polish government sends 3 Polish divisions into the Ukrainian districts to expedite the deportation. At that time, by late 45, the Ukrainian underground in the Polish districts is also fairly well established. The UPA establishes 26 military districts in Poland, and the district consists of 4 UPA battalions. To some extent, they are reinforced by the OUN police groups, as well as certain village self-defense units that occasionally fight with the UPA. Now, as the Polish troops typically enter the village, if they catch any, they first of all threaten people to leave, and sometimes to sign documents, and occasionally some people signed and didn't leave after the troops left. Basically, if they catch any adult males, they typically shoot them. Then they burn some houses and take property, usually horses. And then, interestingly, in these reports that I read, when they return to their base in one of the towns, they typically write a report saying that they were going to such and such a village, they encountered partisans, and they opened a fight with them, killed some, and some houses were destroyed in the process. Now, in the meantime, the UPA begins a systematic attack on the transportation and communication network because people will be moved primarily by railroads. So they blow up railroad bridges, they attack the railroad stations, tear up the railroad lines, cut telephone lines and telegraph lines, and attack Polish troops and this Population Exchange Commission if they should venture into the Ukrainian district, into the Ukrainian areas. So basically, through the fall of 45 and the early winter of 46, this type of things continue. Some people are driven to the railroad station. One of the problems was that, which added to this fiasco, was that people, while this was voluntary, people had to sign documents. Ukrainians leaving Poland had to sign documents that they are leaving voluntarily. And since people, obviously most of them did not go voluntarily, the Polish government had to terrorize these people to sign these documents. And then part of the terror was the numerous attacks on the Ukrainian villages, forcing people to finally leave. So this continues through the fall and early winter of 46, and the results thus far are not that good. And so in the spring of 1946, the Polish army issues so-called Operation Rzeszów. More troops are moved in to the Ukrainian districts. The deportation line is extended to July of 1940, at the time I should say, to 1946. And this continues until July of 46, by which time approximately 500,000 Ukrainians leave for Ukraine. During this time, my guesstimate is that about of the 15,000 losses in the home area and what number of people killed, the Ukrainian civilian losses during the period of 1942-46 amounted to about 25,000 people. Now, it should be remembered that these are estimates, and the reality is that nobody really knows how many people exactly got killed, but this is probably a fairly accurate number. During this time, to give you some idea on the level of violence here, during this time, the two Ukrainian battalions operating in the Carpathian Mountains, based on their monthly battalion operation report between January and July of 1946. These two battalions staged 180 attacks on the Polish facilities, troops, and so forth. So now we're in the summer of 1946, and the Polish authorities at this point feel that they have deported most of the Ukrainians, and the underground is heavily damaged, and it should wither away without the support of the Ukrainian population. And so the Polish troops, most of the Polish troops are withdrawn from Ukrainian districts, and the UPA reduces its operation against the Polish army since the deportation started, and there's no point blowing up bridges anymore. While this is the general impression, many Polish officers who were in charge of this operation are not that certain that their strategy accomplished what they set out. This was one of the most vociferous person was General Stepan Goliash, was to next year conduct the Operation Vistula, and he claimed that there were about 20,000 Ukrainians left, which was a gross underestimation, because there were actually closer to 200,000 Ukrainians left. And he urged that all the Ukrainians be removed to eliminate possible irredentist movement in this area. And initially, Soviet authorities were approached about taking additional Ukrainians. They decided they received a reply from Foreign Ministry that they weren't going to organize another deportation campaign. So if they want to remove the Ukrainians, to deport them to western area of Poland. This was the area that was detached from Germany, and Germans were driven out, and so there was a lot of space over there. And at some point in the late 1946, more troops are beginning to move into the Ukrainian districts again, and naturally, the fight with the UPA flares up, and the army is instructed to, without raising any alarm, to enumerate the number of Ukrainians still left, because the problem was that the Poles never knew how many Ukrainians there were or how many were left. One of the problems was, this sort of reminds me of the reading about the old Tatar attacks on Ukrainians. When the Polish troops were approaching, people fled, especially like the Carpathian Mountains, fled to the woods. And also even afterwards, after the deportation ended, if Polish troops were moving through the village, everybody went indoors so as not to make contact and provoke some kind of action. And so it was difficult for the Poles to enumerate correctly how many Ukrainians were actually left. This continues, and it picked up after 1947 parliamentary election, because during that election, the communists with their allies gained control of the parliament. Naturally, this is disputed as to how many votes they got, but another issue. And at this point, troops begin to attack the underground, and more troops keep moving into the area. And these preparations are taken surreptitiously so as not to arouse any concern among the population who may flee again. So then in March of 1947, a general by the name of Sierczewski decides to inspect the Polish troops conducting anti-operations in the Carpathians. And so he travels into the area. Now, Sierczewski has a very interesting biography. He was a Pole from the Warsaw area, which was under Poland prior to World War II. During the Russian Revolution, he ended up in St. Petersburg, and as a young man joined the Red Army, with the Red Army, and eventually achieved the rank of a general. And during the Spanish War, he was part of the Soviet contingent that supported the Republican Army during the Spanish Civil War. And at one point, he commanded the 36th International Division, which supposedly included an American unit fighting with the Spanish Republican Army. After the uprising, after the Civil War in Spain, he was returned to the Soviet Union, a division commander, and participated in the defense of the Soviet Union. Then in 1943, the Soviet Union begins to organize Polish People's Army, that is a communist army, and many officers many Soviet officers are assigned to this new army. Most of them appear to be of Polish extraction, and Sierczewski is one of them. He then participates, commanding a Soviet army, field army, in a drive to Germany, and subsequently becomes a deputy minister of defense. On March 28, his convoy is ambushed in the Carpathian Mountains, and he and several officers are killed. At this point, the deportation of Ukrainians to Western Poland goes into overdrive. It's no longer secret. All sorts of decrees are issued, and different departments are mobilized to prepare for the deportation of all Ukrainians in a matter of months. And so by the end of April, they start deporting us. At this point, additional troops are moved into the Ukrainian areas, now totaling about 17,000 men. The other thing is that they also change their tactics. In the previous deportations, the deportations were continued simultaneously along the 300-mile border with Ukraine, and most of the units were assigned to removing people, and fewer were assigned to fight the UPA. This time, the process is reversed. Most of these 17,000 troops are moved into the three counties in the Carpathians, Peremyśl, Lisko, and Sanok. This was the area of the two battalions, and this was a partisan country where the Poles ventured into the countryside only in force. And so at this point, most of the troops are assigned to fight the underground, and the underground at this point is, in some cases, some of the reports that I had seen, in some cases they are outnumbered by about 1,000 to 1, where you'd have, 100 to 1, where you'd have several battalions chasing a unit of about 80 men or something through the forest. So naturally, they cannot provide any resistance, and the people are at the end of April, people are deported. Now, this deportation was a little bit different from the previous year because the area was flooded with Poles. There was no UPA resistance, and typically, like in our village, the village was surrounded in the morning, and we were told to. There was a meeting in one of the houses, and we were told to leave by noon, which was several hours. Actually, it took longer than that. And the other thing was people were taken to the railroad station. There was no charade about signing anything voluntary. They were just put aboard the next available train and sent west. And when they were to be dispersed among the Poles to facilitate assimilation, and the specification was that the Ukrainians should comprise no more than 10% of the population in any locale, because the Poles significantly underestimated the number of Ukrainians. Adjustments had to be made, but basically the same format was followed. People were dispersed among Poles with the intent of assimilation, to make the assimilation as rapid as possible. According to the official report, by July of 1947, about 140,000 Ukrainians are reported as having been deported to Western Poland. However, the deportations continued into the autumn in some areas up north in the home area and in some of the Lemko districts out west. And I have to really go back a bit. When the Polish troops moved to 3 counties, in about a week and a half, they removed most of the people there. They leave some troops to fight the UPA, and they moved to the next several counties. And then they moved to the next several counties along the Ukrainian-Polish border. And so in each case, the Ukrainian underground is overwhelmed, and people simply cannot escape this because the area is always flooded with troops. In any event, by July 1947, about 140,000 Ukrainians are removed, and probably another 20,000 or so are removed later. There are some people that are still left, but very few. Some had changed their nationality. One of the things how the Ukrainians attempted to evade the deportation is they would go of Polish priests who would give them a certificate that they are Roman Catholics, and if you were a Roman Catholic, you were therefore a Pole, and this enabled them to stay behind. And so, by the autumn of 1947, for Poland, the Ukrainian problem is solved. There are no more Ukrainians in the Ukrainian districts. First of all, when we were deported in the spring of 1947, I was already 12 years old. I was well aware of what was going on. And even before I started working on this book, I was always interested and read a lot. So when I finally got hold of the archival material, for me, there was nothing new. It just filled in certain areas. And the other thing is, instead of my relying on my memory, which are necessity, not, that accurate and just I have the information about a very small place like our village. I found nothing surprising because I was always afraid. I was always aware of that. Insofar as discussing with other people, we generally, most of my family, my uncles and aunts, after the war in the United States, so frequently we got together. One of the common things that we talk about was all these situations. So I found nothing new there except, as I said, they just filled in some gaps that I had. After the collapse of communism, the Polish parliament apologized for the Akcja Wisła. However, nothing, in my opinion, very little has changed. For instance, there would have been close to 200,000 Ukrainians that were in Poland. They are now down to 35,000, according to the Polish 2011 census. This is an unrealistically small figure, even allowing for a selection. Most of these people who were deported were embittered, and they weren't going to accept, Polish identity readily. This is so. I'm not really sure whether the Polish statistics were purposely inaccurate or whether many Ukrainians are afraid of identifying them as Ukrainians. I met one who was a chemist and now lives in the United States. And he said when he called himself Ukrainian, he had all sorts of problems. So he finally started filling out his name as a Pole, and he didn't have all these previous troubles. The other thing is when Cardinal Wojtyla came to Poland, he urged that the Poles turn over the Ukrainian cathedral in Peremyśl to the Ukrainians, and there were all sorts of demonstrations against it, and it never happened. So, on a geopolitical level, there is a change of attitude, primarily because both Ukraine and Poland are afraid of another Russian reconquest. So this makes sense not to bring up the old wounds, because nothing will be gained with this. However, on a personal level, I am not that sure, and of course, there is no way of proving that, because you need some kind of a type of survey that as far as I know, nobody conducted. So, but anyway, I think that on a personal level, things have changed. I mean, at least nobody's killing each other, but there's still a lot of animosity. I think some progress has been made. On the other hand, as my aunt says, Poles and Ukrainians will never be brothers. Now, that's going a little bit too far, but I think you have to probably wait another generation or so until those who experience these things have died, and the new generation looks at this as just part of history that is usually from tragedies. My whole point was that this is a horrific topic, which, in my opinion, was never adequately discussed. And since I was there and I have the academic training to do it, I felt obliged that I should write this up before I become senile. Well, I call it a civil war because it basically, both populations, through their insurgencies and even personally, fought each other. For instance, in our area, after the fall of Poland, This way, I'm from a Lemko region, so we in our area call ourselves Ukrainians. But as during the war, the Polish-Ukrainian animosities increased. Basically, as nearly as I can determine, the basic problem was that Poles accused Ukrainians of collaborating with Germans. Ukrainians, on the other hand, didn't feel they were collaborating. To them, this was just a change of occupation. First, they were occupied by Poles; now they're occupied by Germans. So there was very little sentiment of if you examine the Polish interwar relationship and the Polish efforts, it's foolish to think that the Ukrainians would be loyal to the Polish regime. So the Ukrainians then begin to, Ukrainian police are organized, and on a local level, some Ukrainian officials are put in. And of course, Germans, Ukrainians, not because they loved Ukrainians, but it's the old thing of divide and conquer. So this was a mixed area. So in the Polish areas, there were Polish police, and in the Ukrainian areas, there were Ukrainian police. Poles, we're not used to that type of change, and so in some ways, as I look at that, it was sort of like the civil rights movement in the U.S. and especially during the Reformation, the Ukrainians were allotted certain slot in society, and when they tried to move out of it, there was a reaction against this, and so you had a lot of Polish attacks. And most people don't realize how much violence there was on a non-organized basis, because there was no authority. That whatever authority consisted in our area was in towns, and so people were armed, and so you had a lot of gangs attacking Ukrainians and claiming to be doing sort of patriotic work for Poland. And of course, on the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainians were doing the same thing to Poles. And so when you talk about these Polish underground and the Ukrainian underground, yes, they were there. They were the major force, but they weren't the only force. There was a lot of ad hoc violence, which really was criminal, but it generally took the sort of coloration of being something patriotic. Well, I think there is general awareness among Ukrainians, those of Ukrainian descent, insofar as the general American population is concerned. I think there is very little. There was, especially when you get into World War II, you concentrate on Pearl Harbor, you concentrate on the invasion, and this is just a minor addition to this worldwide conflict. So, except for the people who specialize in this, there's a very limited interest in all of this in the general American population. But among the Ukrainians, and there are some that are truly involved in this. Others just are aware of this and show up to picnics and demonstrations. I simply I had written a book which will be published by a Lemko organization, which Diana Volian'ska is involved with, and this is a recollection about our village, and I wrote about that first because this is on a more personal level, insofar as the just to briefly outline our village. When the Red Army was pushing the Germans back, the Germans fortified some areas in the Carpathian Mountains, and our village was one of the areas where the major battle took place. So we were bombed for 5 days by the planes, and then we were shelled for 3 days by the German artillery because the Germans were dug in on the hills behind west and south of the village, so that days for the Red Army to get those hills. And then the deportation started. We really 2 families from our village left because the village was destroyed. Only about 6 houses were left. As I said, our village was a scene of a major battle. And then in our area, the deportations really started in January of 1946. The Polish army started raiding our village and others. Our village suffered more for, among other things, we were on a so-called major road over there. So our priest was killed with his family. And between January of 1946 until the summer when everybody was deported to the east, 22 people in our village were killed. This was probably more than what typical village suffered, but it was not by any means all that exceptional because some villages were virtually completely erased. So I decided to write up about our nation because it nails down to what actually happened instead of talking about broad statistics and how many thousands were killed, and which is very abstract. Yes, in terms of loss of human life, this was greater in our area than it was when the actual war was fought. For instance, in the autumn of 44, our village was bombed and burned and all of that. Only about 6 houses were left standing, but only 2 civilians were killed because my grandmother and my aunt were set out the whole thing in the cellar that we had. Some people fled the village, and so during the war, of course, a lot of young people left or were taken forcibly to work in Germany. But besides that, those that actually remained during the fighting, only 2 civilians got killed. The factor was that when the Soviet army was fighting the German army, they weren't targeting people; they were fighting each other. But when we were being deported, it's the civilians that were actually targeted. And so it became more personal, and that's why in Western Ukraine and in our area in Poland, you have a horrendous population losses.